They wrote an article that was very difficult to find in Scientific American. And did they call it, "We Found the Mid-Atlantic Ridge"? No, actually, can you believe if this happened today by, Woods Hole oceanographers? They titled the article, "Glimpses of Atlantis."
A Codega is a guide and a storyteller, escorting you through the night, lighting the way, warding off thieves, ghosts, demons, and other oddities. Along the journey, his companions would often share with him the most curious of stories that he'd record in his Codex. Perhaps you just might find yourself traveling with a Codega and sharing one of yours. Click that like.
Yeah!
If you're new here, subscribe and have the bell hit for notifications to stay up to date on all of the new content. In 1900 BC, the Minoan civilization on Crete rose to prominence, its influence stretching across the Mediterranean. It is said that their knowledge of engineering, navigation, and even astronomy was far ahead of its time. Some researchers speculate that the Minoans could be a fragment of the Atlantean legacy, survivors of a lost civilization whose memory lingers in myth. One of the most tantalizing connections comes from the eruption of Thera, a volcanic explosion around 1600 BC that devastated the region. This event closely mirrors Plato's description of Atlantis sinking into the sea in a single day and night of calamity. Could the Minoans have been Atlantis inheritors, tasked with preserving a fraction of its knowledge before it disappeared forever? While the evidence is circumstantial, it paints a compelling picture, an advanced society lost to history, whose achievements are remembered only as echoes in a myth. The story of Atlantis endures, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a mystery that continues to challenge our understanding of humanity's past. Welcome back, seekers of the strange and sublime, to another enthralling episode of Codega's Codex of Curiosities. I'm Rai, your Codega, guiding you through the shadowy history, the avenues of this myth to uncover humanity's greatest mysteries. Tonight, we dive into one of those most endearing legends of all time, Atlantis. Is it a mere myth, or does it hold the key to understanding a lost chapter of human history? Our guest, Michael Laflam, has dedicated himself to answering that question in his groundbreaking book, Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. He takes us on a journey through the historical, metaphysical, and esoteric dimensions of Atlantis, challenging what we think we know about the ancient world. Prepare to have your perceptions expanded as we discuss the advanced knowledge, technological wonders, and spiritual insights that may have been lost when Atlantis fell, and what its rediscovery could mean for us today. All right, everyone. Before we uncover the secrets of the deep, don't forget to check out Codega's Codex of Curiosities merch store. From Atlantean-inspired designs to gear for every lover of the strange, we have something for all of the explorers of the unknown. Your support keeps me going into these mysteries and, keeps bringing, helps me shed light on these fascinating stories. All right, let's take a look at those, that merch. All right. Make sure you grab a piece of the puzzle at the merch store. And without further ado, let's bring Michael Laflam to the stage. Michael, how are you doing? And welcome to Codega's Codex of Curiosities.
Hi, Rai. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you too. And I'm glad to have you on. I've looked. I have not fully read your book. I've looked into it. Mark Steves recommended you after he went into some great detail about Atlantis with me in a couple episodes prior, and I'm like, I gotta have Michael on, and let's go deeper into this enigma that is Atlantis.
Sure. Well, thank you, and great merch. I'm gonna have to pick up. What is it? I believe in Bigfoot and coffee, and you know,
UFOs, yeah, exactly. And
yeah, I believe in all three. That's interesting.
well, that's my merch store. What about you? Do you have a place that anybody can find you at, or and where they can find your books as well, or your book as well?
Yeah, well, you can actually go to Michael Laflam, all one word, .com, and it's a little website with links to some of my other interviews and the book. But the book is actually it's in English and Spanish on Amazon, and also audiobook if people are interested. And if for you lazy readers out there,
That
the
that
people that
is
don't
that
have
is
time.
me. I'm like the like I've switched from. I know this is going to be on YouTube as well, but I also put it on audio format as well, and that is
Hmm,
me. I'm an audio guy because I'm too busy working and doing other stuff, and so I just like
too
to.
busy. Everybody's too busy.
That's exactly it. I just like to put
Yeah,
my headphones on and listen away to audiobooks and to
yeah.
everything else as
Well,
well.
I tell people, I'm too busy reading to listen to audiobooks. That's
Fair
my
enough.
one.
And 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 I'll be honest, I really want to get back into reading. It's like I need to schedule time to read. Almost it sounds
Yeah,
ridiculous, but it's the truth.
yeah. I like both, but it's there's certainly something different. I think that you can't get. I think, especially I struggled with that with making this an audiobook, and it sold a lot of copies um, in the audio version, but it's a subject that really lends itself, I think, to reading. And the way I wrote the book was, I guess, I'm always reading a couple books at a time. And, while the book does follow a kind of storyline, it's quite self contained. Each chapter is something that you could read and put down and come back, because the way the book works is kind of um, a chronological history, but also a very different, thematic approach, I think, than a lot of people. I had looked at, I think, a lot of books on the subject, and I think they kind of fell into two camps. It was either 100% channeled remote view. I had a girlfriend in Atlantis who was a mermaid, and shaman told me this, or it was incredibly boring, dry. Let's look at how many inches this rock formation in Bimini was down to the millimeter, and just endless kind of overload of scientific data without any context. And so what I tried to do, because I was trained as a history professor, as an intellectual historian who looks at, well, when did ideas begin and how did they evolve? And I hadn't really seen somebody do that with this topic. And I thought that was critical, because you can have all the data in front of you, but if you don't have a paradigm, in which to plug that data in, it can go totally below the radar. And I think that's what's happened with this subject is it's either been overanalyzed by people who don't have a big picture view, or it's been relegated to some sort of, myth or some sort of fairy tale, when in fact, the real story that I discovered was not only compelling, but actually explains a lot more of the current world we live in and all of its strange similarities between cultures and legends, if you want to call them that. And actually lined up with a lot of the most recent compelling geological data, particularly from the Younger Dryas impact event. So I think what I was trying to do is take all that, put it in a kind of like Michael Crichton thriller type book, and also add to that the clairvoyant and remote viewing non-local perception aspect, which I think had been, again, kind of put in its own bag, but which actually supplemented a lot of the hard evidence that I had uncovered.
I think that's fantastic. Because Yeah, because like the one is kind of almost gets dubbed like fantastical kind of thing, and
Mm,
then the other one, I agree with you, it gets too boring. Like I've read some of the books where it is all scientific, and they lose me. I'm like, okay, and I'm drowning, I'm losing interest in this, and I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, but I got to move on to another book. I need something to keep
right.
me captivated, and so what you did is kind of married both of those together.
Yeah. And, I did a lot of the boring legwork, reading the pyramid, you know, um, text and things like this, or just going through, for example, 10,000 Edgar Cayce readings until I found new ones that pointed to kind of important discoveries that I think had been overlooked. And a brief background, because this character figures so prominently in the book. It's a character that really convinced me of the powers of non-local perception. And I've since, studied it quite extensively and talked to people who work in, Stanford and Dean Radin and people like that who actually measure extrasensory perception and can prove that it exists. Of course, the government has used it with Project Stargate and Grill Flame and things like this. But Edgar Cayce was extremely important to this story because here's a guy who, around the turn of the century, goes mute from a rare case of extreme meningitis. And, he's just a kid and he lives in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And at the time, there was a hypnotist who was visiting the Hopkinsville Opera House. And his friend said, "Hey, why don't you go talk to this hypnotist? Maybe he can actually help you with your meningitis." And so, through this therapy with this guy who was called the Laugh Man, I think was his nickname, Lane the Laugh Man, he actually gets cured of meningitis. And the guy says to him, the hypnotist, "Look, you seem to be extremely, susceptible to hypnotism. You should try autosuggestive hypnotism for other things." And through this process, he cured his son later on of, I think it was temporary blindness from an injury, and later discovered that he could absorb information from books simply by sleeping next to them. And this was documented actually in his time.
I need
And
I need this power. I need this power to sleep next
yeah,
to the books and
well,
absorb them.
I used to sleep next to my books in graduate school because I couldn't read them all in time. So
You're like,
maybe I
let's
was
let's
like
give it a
some.
shot.
I
Yeah.
swear to God, I used to sleep with like my biographies of Stalin and Hitler and things like this. But probably just from passing out from reading, 900 pages biography of Joseph Stalin all day. But he later, I would say 15, 20 years into his career, as he was giving health diagnoses to people and curing people of things like, tumors that nobody knew existed at the time. And then they'd go to the doctor and they say, "Actually, how did you know to tell us to look here?" And he said, "Oh, Mr. Casey, the sleeping prophet, the man who could lie down on a couch, induce a deep hypnagogic REM sleep trance, and then a voice would speak through him using his body as a channel." And again, this, I totally understand why most people think this is ridiculous, but the difference is with him, he had a stenographer present for all of his major sessions, and she transcribed 14,000 of these readings. And many people, including myself, have gone through the majority of them. And that's what took me so long to write this book, was to standardize and check across 45 years of this man doing this. And there are almost no inconsistencies, including with his intern who lived with him and said, "Look, I'm a psychologist. I'm an atheist. I came here to basically debunk him because my wife asked me to come here as part of an internship at the end of his life." He came in and stayed 2 years with Casey. And he says, "I can't explain this." Because, for example, he would do things like, he talked about the Essenes, for example, the sect of Christianity that Casey argued Jesus was, a member of the Essenes, when nobody had even discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was in 1943. He gave these readings, particular readings, and he described, they're going to be found here. There are documents that support this. And unless you were a theological scholar at the Vatican in 1940, you would never discuss the Essenes. You never, that word wasn't even in common parlance. And yet he said where they would be found, the documentation, that there were women who were part of the group. And his apprentice, Harmon Brough, said, look, for years after Cayce died, we said, oh, well, he was wrong with that one. So maybe he just made the rest up. And then he said, to my shock, when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was exactly down to the characters in the stories what Cayce had been talking about. And so that's why I picked him as a, primary clairvoyant source, because one of his other side stories in his thousands of subjects he covered, past lives in ancient Rome, hidden treasure, people who were trying to find the Lusitania, the wreck of the Lusitania, actually came to Cayce to ask him, where is the Lusitania, sunk off the coast of Ireland? And he gave them precise directions. He even said where the torpedo hit. He said the souls that were trapped in there are still waiting to be discovered. They're lonely. They're crying out for help. Very bizarre reading. He talked to Amelia Earhart's husband, used Edgar Cayce to find her. What happened to her? He said her co-pilot's dead and she's dying. And then he came back a month later and he said she just died of exposure and a terrible storm near Howland Island. So this wasn't a person that was like a carnival trick. This was a guy that allegedly even Woodrow Wilson used as a consultant, the broker of the Versailles Treaty. So I think when he talks about Atlantis, for example, and you look at what he says, it's astounding how much of what he says actually lines up, not just with what Plato says, but many other stories around the world that he could not physically have had any knowledge of as a uneducated Sunday school teacher. That was his day job, who never went to high school, never went to college, never read any primary sources of ancient history. According to his children, he only had a couple romance novels, the Bible, and he read the newspaper. But when he was asleep, he had access to the Akashic records, the Akashic field, whatever you want to call it, quantum field of knowledge, and he could pull anything that had actually happened in history. He could pull from that and give you, as he said, I'm only as good as the needle on a record player. So you might have the same record, but some days the needle's scratched. I'm having a bad day. I'm stressed. Or the people in the room are affecting it because they're not believing me. So that will interfere with my transmission. But he said the best readings were with a group of people that were skeptical but open-minded, who legitimately wanted to know the truth. And that's when he would give some of his most precise, very detailed readings, which I find actually invaluable to this field. I couldn't have even come close to explaining what probably went on without this man's work. So I'm tremendously indebted to the work of Edgar Cayce.
Wow, that is fantastic. I've never actually gone like I know who Edgar Cayce is, but I've never dove in deep with into him. And this is fascinating. All this, and you said there was 14,000 readings, like transcriptions that you went through about 10,000 of them.
I went through. There's about 850 that specifically mention Atlantis in the database, and thank God they've digitized it so you can do keyword searches. Back in the old days, you had to go to Virginia Beach and like physically look through a catalog of 14,000 transcriptions, some of which are like 20 pages long. But I'll give you an example for those skeptics out there. One time, Edgar Cayce was talking about the landscape in so-called prehistory, and he described the continent of Africa. And he said, well, it was quite different then. He said, in fact, the Nile River actually flowed from its origin point, where it still is today, but through Central Africa and actually emptied into the Atlantic Ocean near the Congo end of the West African coast. Now, he said this in the 20s. Well, there were no satellites in the 20s. Well, in 1986, the Space Shuttle satellite imaging radar actually discovered this river. And it actually does end up in the Congo near the Bight of Benin, exactly where he said it would. And they say the headwaters are at the Nile. And it was just buried under 5 feet of sand. That's just one example. of actual hard evidence. The other thing I told you is also it's statistically impossible. He said Jesus belonged to a group of, initiates called the Essenes, and they lived near, this area, and they did this and that, and some of their member names were this. Well, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and the Essenes and Gnostic Christianity later, with the Nag Hammadi Codex, was exposed, everything he said panned out. It's like these aren't random guesses. And my final one that's relevant to Atlantis, but just as a kind of hard data, because I didn't want to just say, Edgar Cayce said Atlantis was real. I really wanted to approach this like a forensic, investigator. And one time somebody said to him, when was the Great Pyramid constructed and how long did it take? And his immediate answer from his trance, he said it was started in the year 10,490 BC, and it ended in 10,390 BC. It took 100 years, and it was built by a coalition of emigres who were fleeing the soon-to-be destroyed Atlantis, native Egyptians, and a member of royalty, including the old Cayce, who was a reincarnation of this character he claims, Rata, who is a king from the Caucasus Mountains. And that date was given in 1922, 23, I think, in a reading. Okay. Nobody at that time was talking about the pyramid was 10,000 years old or 12,000 years old. Well, think about Robert Bauval when he plugged in the precession of the equinoxes. When was the constellation Orion exactly a mirror of the Giza complex? 10,450 BC. Now, he didn't discover that until 1980. How did this guy guess this? And then you start to plug in other dates that he gives for extinctions of animals that were not known, or even that date, the 10,000, 500 BC range. And as science and geology and archaeoastronomy develops, you start to realize this Younger Dryas impact event and the comet stream that very likely hit the Earth, it all falls into that window that this man, the sleeping prophet sitting on his couch in Virginia Beach, figured out all along, almost 100 years ago. It's astounding.
It is extremely fascinating, like to be able to do those kinds of things. It's and I do know, like, there's more. Like he talked about finding like almost a library right underneath the Sphinx or in the Sphinx itself.
Yeah, well, he talks about that a lot. The Hall of Records, and there being three. He would claim there are three locations. One of them, he says, is actually underground between the old Nile River and the Sphinx, but is accessed through a tunnel, allegedly underneath the Sphinx, through its right forepaw. And, many people have looked for that for a long time. I think it's very likely that he's telling the truth about that. The other ones are, well, one is disputable. I've seen many people because the reading is given in a trance. And so you got to go by what the stenographer says. And there's one reading that, like a semicolon, could change the location of where it is. So I can't say, but the other one is very clearly, he states, in what he calls British Honduras, which is now Belize. And many people have thought it's, near Piedras Negras in Honduras and things like this. But certainly a Central American location because, the Yucatan features prominently, believe it or not, in his Atlantean saga as a refuge for one of the noble families that was leaving. A guy by the name of Iltar, he says, actually came to the Yucatan during the final and third destruction, which he places around 10,500 BC, with a group of people, and later the descendants of these people, and became what we would call the Maya, and then later the Aztecs being a branch of that. And it's fascinating because if you look at Mesoamerican legends, you see that word Aztlan, even the Aztecas talk about their homeland being Aztlan, and I find it fascinating because what I tried to do was look at the, quite boring to most people geological data, but make it interesting. But then also, it all started to fit together in a way that quite surprisingly shocked me because believe it or not, I didn't start this, 7 years ago, or 10 years ago now, but I published it 2 years ago. It took me about 7 years to do this,
Wow. Yeah.
but I didn't write this book to prove the existence of Atlantis. Believe it or not, I'm a World War II historian by training, and I studied the history of ideas as a subfield. So I wanted to know. Let me take a subject I know very little about outside of you know coming across Atlantis, teaching Greek history or Greek philosophy, because the story does feature in Plato. But I wanted to know, like, what is all this stuff people are talking about? Because I had just seen so much stuff, like on Edgar Cayce, on the Maya, on the Egyptian connection, on the Jimmy Corsetti, Mauritania, all this stuff, and I was like, what is all this? Let me actually just close off my world for 7 years, go into this subject obsessively, and write a definitive investigation, which is what I call the book. It's not a conclusive, finding, although I did find, I would say, two things that nobody has ever found, which to me are astounding if true.
What are
I'll
those
leave it
two
at that.
things?
Well, one is a map, that a channeled map that another clairvoyant, actually earlier than Cayce, a kid living in the Wild West in the American frontier in 1886.
Is
Who,
this the a dweller on two planets?
yes, that's right.
Okay,
One
okay.
of the most misunderstood, I would argue, books in the world, if you read reviews, who treat it as this is a cute fictional story by a child with an active imagination. And I guarantee you, those people have never read that book. They definitely haven't read that book 7 times, as I have. Because if you did, you would discover this is one of the most bizarre, and I've really thought about this a long time. This is one of the most bizarre books. And as you mentioned, it's called A Dweller on Two Planets, but again, purports to be before Edgar Cayce was even on Earth talking about this. A 17-year-old kid started hearing voices, he claimed, when he was out near Mount Shasta, which is a sacred site, and strange things happen around there. But he claims a disincarnate entity named Philos, who had a past life in Atlantis, told him, not in a trance while he was waking, but inspired him. The literal definition we use of inspired, the spirit went into him to write this story and to give him credit. So the book is actually not written by Frederick Oliver. He says, I'm just the muse. I'm just the amanuensis, as he calls it, the scribe. And so, again, interesting that the book starts off in the capital city, which he calls Kaiful, of the island of Poseid in the Atlantean Empire in the year 11,160 BC. Just a few thousand years before the final destruction, according to him. And again, Cayce didn't read this book. He didn't read this book. He didn't read anything but the Bible and the newspaper. And this book was not even published until 1904, didn't get circulated until really 1910, 1920, when it was just looked at as New Age BS. But what's shocking, Rye, is that book gives the ground level, high technology picture that I think so many people just imagine and guess. Oh, Atlantis had this. Oh, Atlantis had. Well, where's the basis for that? To me, I look at what this kid said and I compare it to what Cayce said, and then look where they overlap. And what this kid said is quite astounding, because in this Atlantis, around 11,160 BC, they had reached a level of sophistication that we ourselves today in 2024 are just barely approaching. Perhaps we will, if we don't go to nuclear war tomorrow, we will reach this. And he talks about that. But you're talking about flying cigar-shaped objects that are transmedial, called Valks, which are also mentioned in Sanskrit legends. And he mentions, basically, before Tesla was even doing these experiments, he mentions basically Tesla coils, wireless energy transmission using the Earth as a grounding mechanism. He talks about, a giant pyramid at the center that housed a kind of what the Rosicrucians would later call like the alchemist fire, which he would say was like a polarity exchange point where polarity goes from negative to positive at the focal point. He claimed that's what the alchemists said was, the kind of, I guess, 0 point from which things could be manifested. He called that the maxim, and many other things that give a quite practical explanation, like down to how many years did it take to go to college and what were the requirements in Atlantis. I mean, this is not like some fairy tale. It's like, this is how many plots of land the citizens were granted under this king. This is how the monorail system worked around the capital city, which looked like this, which was this many feet long. And again, it's like, why would he do this if this was just, say, fantasy? I've read fantasy novels. They don't talk about the things
mundane,
that this kid talked, the mundane.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that is extremely interesting. I have not read A Dweller on Two Planets, but I've heard a lot about it, and from what you're telling me, it's extremely fascinating that this this Philos, this disembodied spirit, what would you think Philos is? Is Philos just a regular person, or was it some sort of other entity of sorts? Or
no, he was a regular person. And he described that, like, so he used this American teenager on the frontier whose name was Frederick Oliver. He used him and he said, tell the story of my past life before I was Philos, and I was a person named Zalm Numenos of Querdro Anu. And he says, I lived on the island of Poseid, which is, again, incredibly important because, as Cayce describes, that was the central island in the Atlantean archipelago, which was the nucleus of the global Atlantean empire, much like Great Britain, England, London, City of London. And everybody talks about finding the lost city of Atlantis. But I always tell people, if you found London in 5,000 years, you didn't find the British Empire. You got to go look for the Raj in India. You got to go to Australia. You got to go to North America, technically. You got to go all over the world to see the fingerprints. And so I think that's important and I spent a lot of time in the book distinguishing, like, Atlantis was a global culture that, according to Cayce, had 3 major cataclysmic endings: 50,000 BC, 22,000 BC, and the final ultimate destruction, 10,000 BC, after which they rebooted the culture in Giza, the Yucatan, and parts of the Basque country, where the Basque language itself, I would argue, according to the Center of Basque Studies, which I called in Arizona, they have no explanation for where the Basque language comes from. It's not an Indo-European language, not related to Catalan, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, none of those, Galician, none of those. But it is closely related to Yucatec and the indigenous languages of Central America and Mexico, which is exactly what Cayce said. He said after the central Atlantean archipelago was destroyed, the survivors fled to the north of Spain, to the Pyrenees Mountains, to Giza, and to the Yucatan. And they didn't do it the day the wave came. They did it hundreds of years before, because these people had advanced science and they could see that the climate was changing and that very likely we were going to pass through this torrid asteroid stream. And so they began preparing hundreds, if not maybe even longer, centuries before. And I think part of the confusion comes from when Solon was told the story by Egyptian priests who themselves were 9,000 years removed from the event and in a different language. And then he told Critias, and Critias told the junior, and then he told Plato, and then Plato told us. It turns into a night and a day, you know. That's the actual part that I think is important, is that ironically the clairvoyant sources give a much more mundane, believable, logical explanation for the destruction of the civilization than the part we've inherited of a night and a day, which itself is an incomplete story. It just ends where it says, and then Zeus said, big, you know. So we have to be very careful to look at Plato, who's a genius, who in many respects did transmit the truth to the best of his ability. But we have to stop looking at that as the only source, as if that exists in isolation, when actually there's pre-Platonic sources, there are Indian sources, there are Mesoamerican sources, there are European mentions, and the evidence from Giza, of Giza being an Atlantean reboot at this point, I think is irrefutable, particularly with the work of Manu Safzadeh, who's an archaeologist and an Egyptologist and a dermatologist as well. He's friends with another colleague of mine, and he went down to the Temple of Edfu, and he's one of the few people in the world that can read those hieroglyphs accurately. And he sees evidence on the Temple of Edfu where they talk about Atlantis, and they call it the Isle of the First Waters or the Isle of the Egg. And again, it would explain why Egyptian culture goes from high to low, doesn't progress linearly. It would explain why Robert Schoch has exhaustively explained water erosion on the Sphinx, which was very likely, as I talk about in the book, a lioness that was built before even the pyramid. And it would explain why the pyramid alignments speak of aligning to Orion in 10,450 BC, because these things were built probably by the same people who fled Atlantis before they realized the landmass was going to be uninhabitable, you know, and that it didn't just sink into the ocean in a night and a day. Cayce even describes landslides, then floods, then erosion, then basically a civilizational breakdown, and give it a couple hundred years and it's underwater, very likely where the Azores are today. And I always tell people, nobody knows where the name Azores comes from. People say, oh, well, that's the name of a hawk in Portugal, but nobody actually can prove that. But how interesting that Azores was an Atlantean king. Just like the city of Cadiz, Spain, used to be called Gades, and Gades was an Atlantean king in Plato's dialogues. So even these namesakes, like the Atlantic Ocean, I always tell people,
exactly. That
you
one's
know,
like right in your face. You know?
yeah, maybe that'll be my merch. You know,
Yeah.
Do you believe in the Atlantic Ocean? You know, you must be crazy. You must be crazy. You believe there's an ocean called Atlantic? And people say, yes, of course. I've, swum in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, but why is it a stretch to think that where the Azores are today, which, by the way, another little tidbit, when the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was discovered in 1886, 81, and somewhere around there, over the course of 4 years, with the Challenger expedition particularly. So when this British survey ship came back from discovering this enormous underwater mountain range, where the Azores are the peaks of these mountains, these were mainstream oceanographers, the best in the world. When they came back to London, do you know what they did? They wrote an article that was very difficult to find in Scientific American. And did they call it, "We Found the Mid-Atlantic Ridge"? No, actually, can you believe if this happened today by, Woods Hole oceanographers? They titled the article, glimpses of Atlantis. And they said that story that Plato told, transmitted by Egypt to Solon to Plato, which for so many years we've been wondering, where is this island that's outside the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, is now beginning to turn into a reality. And they go on, and I cite the whole article in the book, because they said all these multiple paths of evidence are now converging to make us believe that as the old America was forming, as Atlantis was sinking, so the sea level was rising in the new Americas, because they were comparing sea level rise on the coast of America, North America, and they talked about it as if it was the most mundane discovery. Like, oh yeah, by the way, that thing Plato talked about, we just found it. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And they weren't clairvoyant. They weren't using trance sessions. They said, look, we found an underwater mountain range where the Azores are the peaks of these underwater mountains. And how interesting also, Rye, that in A Dweller on Two Planets, the book starts with Frederick Oliver's, character, Zalem, in the past life, who's climbing an enormous mountain called Mount Pico, which is an active volcano then. And actually, if you look on the map where he draws that, he calls it Pitach Rock in the Atlantean language. If you look on the map he channeled and drew, which, by the way, no one knew what the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at that point looked like until satellite imagery in the 1960s. Somehow, a kid in a log cabin in 1886 drew an accurate map of the Azores Basin on a sketch pad, which I include in the book, and where he puts Pitach Rock as the largest Atlantean mountain. I superimpose the map over a printout of a satellite map, and lo and behold, you have modern day Mount Pico, one of the largest, if you measure it from the base, mountains in the world, which goes half underwater. So again, these are not random guesses. Plato said it was out in front of the Straits of Gibraltar. That was his literal definition. The Azores are in front of the Straits of Gibraltar. They're in the Atlantic Ocean. The people that found the Mid-Atlantic Ridge said the Azores are the mountain peaks of Atlantis. The people of the Azores, when interviewed, all say, we all know this used to be Atlantis. Why is this still a question? I found a newspaper reporter who interviewed people in the 80s. They said, even the taxi driver had a copy of Plato's dialogues. He said, look, Plato says it right here. What are you talking about? So I wanted to show people, kind of like how people for the last, 4 years until he won the election were embarrassed to say, I support Donald Trump. I wanted to say to people, look, it's okay. I'll take the criticism, and others before. Graham Hancock took all the criticism for everybody. But it's okay, because guess what? The CIA uses remote viewers, and they've discovered military installations all around the world, even to the point where they could read files in the filing cabinets in the Soviet Union in the 70s, according to their, Pat McMonagle and all their great remote viewers. So remote viewing's real. Get over it. It's incontrovertible, basically, at this point, that the Earth was hit by a comet stream 12,000 years ago. I don't think that's debatable anymore.
Exactly. I find that one of the most fascinating thing is when you have archaeological historians, who fight irrefutable evidence. It's kind of like, no, I just want to hold on to this. I want to hold on to what I was taught, and this is the way it goes. I find it ridiculous that people just can't say, yeah, okay, we need to add this in. We need to change our what we thought was our history and change it. Like, it's
right. Well, I think I always tell people, like, I'm a big fan of Alexander the Great. Like, for example, take the movie adaptation, of this character. I'll give you an example. Like, how many people have made movies or written stories or podcasts on, well, then Alexander said this, and then at the Granicus River, he got hit in the head, and the amount of sources. Well, first of all, we have 0 primary sources from that time period. If they existed, they were like Ptolemy's accounts, which were destroyed in the Library of Alexandria fire. The only accounts we have of even like the main battles of Gaugamela are tiny, tiny fragments of Persian records, and then records from Rome 600 years later by Arrian and things like this, who weren't even there. And yet we know for a fact that this is where the army units of Darius were, and then Alexander marched his horse. How the hell how do you know that? We don't even have accurate figures. Like if you look at any historian, they'll say, well, Alexander's army was anywhere from 20,000 to 62,000 at that battle. And then Darius could have had 1 million men, or 36,000, or 59,000, or 100,000. It's like total guesswork. And nobody has a problem with that, because it still falls in the accepted category of, well, we can imagine it was a guy on a horse. We've seen that. It's not fantastical. It's within the acceptable bounds of discussion. So we can take liberty. But suddenly you talk about the extinction level, basically, of a high civilization. And I don't know if it's, fear that could happen to us, or arrogance and an inability to admit we're not at the peak of civilization, or what I think it really is, as an academic myself, its professional reputations would be forever destroyed. All the people who were teaching, well, we started from hunter-gatherers, and then Sumeria, and then Assyria, then the Hittites, then this, and it's like, yeah, no, actually, no, there's a whole nother timeline that you're not taking into consideration, which would upend the entire discipline. And I think that's what, is pretty evident when you watch Hancock or Robert Bauval or all these other people who have done tremendous work, to which we're all indebted as, investigators and researchers. And you're right, they never get refuted. They just get, well, you're just one of, always an ad hominem attack, or it's some other sort of cherry picking of evidence.
Exactly. It's kind of like we will try to discredit that person or to attack that character, to make them look like this crazy fanatical person. So anything else they bring forth, we can just throw away with the rest of it.
That's right. I mean, I always tell people the Great Pyramid, has roughly 2.3 million blocks. Each one weighs more than the standard SUV in Western world. Just explain to me, like a little child, how did they build it? And let me tell you something. Nobody can explain that. Nobody can explain it. Nobody has ever explained it. They make up all kinds of bend over backward explanations, but the
ridiculous explanation that I've heard recently is the floating, how they're floating the bricks, and they built like a channel up beside the side of the pyramid to raise these bricks up. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, the amount of engineering that you're going to need for that is crazy.
Well, Cayce and Oliver had much simpler explanations. Oliver described that the cutting technology in Atlantis was the finest in the world, he described it as. He says that we could cut through any stone with any hardness, and our tools were many orders of magnitude more advanced than 19th century Americans who were reading the book, or the presumed soon-to-be book. He didn't plan on publishing it. His mother published it after he died, actually, 15 years later, which is important. He didn't write this for publicity, and he just put it in his drawer. But Cayce actually says that the blocks were moved through decoupling them with gravity. He actually did say the blocks were floated into place. How? He doesn't go into detail, because probably the person asking him that in 1925 was like, okay, yeah, I just wanted a real explanation. I didn't want this weirdo crap, not realizing that they were providing, future generations this like endless catalog of, and it's beyond frustrating sometimes, because you're like, couldn't you have asked him just one more level, please. Like,
Yes.
and it drives me crazy because there are certain readings where somebody's like, what about this? And he gives you the answer. And I'm like, oh my God. And it's like, and how do I make my wife's left breast bigger? Because it's a little shorter. And he's like, apply cocoa butter, but don't apply it to the breast, apply it to that. And it's like, oh my, like you had access to this guy and you're asking him how to make your wife's left boob bigger,
Oh,
Or how do I stop snoring, Mr. Cayce? It's like, ask him where the Hall of Records is, please, again and again and again.
yes.
But it just shows you
Let's
that,
narrow this down. Yeah.
yeah, it just shows you though that, this guy, he didn't give these readings for entertainment. He himself, when he came out of the trance, used to ask the stenographer, well, what did I say? And he would read it and say, well, I don't know. What does all that mean? Like, where are these places? I don't even know where is Giza? And she's like, it's in Egypt. And he's like, I seem to be talking about that a lot. There must be something to that. He had no interest in this subject when he was awake. He said, I just doing this as a Christian so I can help people learn from their past life lessons, some of which were very bad things that they did in Egypt and Atlantis and places like this. So, to me, I think what was more interesting to kind of wrap up was seeing like the process that people go through to decide something is true, which is ultimately what the book kind of like morphed into. Was, yes, it is an investigation, a very technical investigation of the historical, archaeological, cultural, linguistic roots of this story. But it ends up being like, well, what is true about the past, particularly the ancient past? Like, what can we say with absolute authority about Julius Caesar, Jesus Christ, Krishna, Buddha, ancient Greece? What do we really know beyond a shadow of a doubt? And how much of it is just kind of wishful thinking, you know?
That is a great question, because it truly is. What is wishful thinking? Or perhaps what has been superimposed on top of our actual history to, to control our mindset, to control our direction, to control us. And
Yeah.
before we head out here, I know we got maybe like 10 more minutes here.
Hmm.
This civilization that was Atlantis and how advanced they were in comparison to, the rest of the world. How did they become so advanced in comparison? Like for most part, most cultures seem to elevate, not always, but they seem to elevate kind of together, but they seem
Hmm.
to be, well, thousands, 20 to 30,000 years ahead of us.
Well, according to Cayce, this was a very long process, and it requires you to think very differently than traditional, historians think about timelines. Like, Europe went from horse and buggy in 1700 to an airplane in 1903. Like, that's an incredible arc. So you can imagine at one point there was some sort of moment, but again, Cayce says this this civilization, the hardest part is like believing in the final destruction of Atlantis is to me the easiest because that's only 12,000 years ago. He says the civilization had its origins up to and including, depending on how you interpret his readings, like 100,000 BC. That there was something on Earth, and the Sumerians would say the same thing, 100,000 years ago. Now, these are timelines that, like, I myself, it's very difficult to imagine that scale. Like, it's hard to imagine 2,000 years ago back in ancient
Exactly.
Rome. That's really difficult, actually, for me to go 2,000 years back. Imagine going 100,000 years back. And, Cayce said each of these iterations, that Atlantis began as a much larger mid-Atlantic continent that he said stretched basically the whole mid-Atlantic ridge and then was slowly through three catastrophes whittled down into the version Plato told us. Because Plato's only talking about the final destruction. And so by the final destruction, Cayce said they had actually reached their peak technologically. even though the demise was coming. And they had become incredibly, bifurcated into like this Jedi council that was like warning people of the misuse of technology, and these like basically like World Economic Forum Nazis that had like a transhumanist agenda. Really, I mean, that's how he describes it. And very similar to the world today. It's actually not that strange when you look at what was going on then. And I think that's part of the reason this theme is back, because we are very likely in another Atlantean loop, I would argue. But those two factions, had technologies that, to answer your question, that were very different. Like there was like the mentalism technology of like absolute telepathy, clairvoyance, communication with what he called the people from the other worlds through portals. But then there was like the material, like if the Nazis had won and kept going with their rocket program and all of their technology, like ultra destructive weapons, including this thing called the terrible crystal, which again is eerily reminiscent 50 years before Star Wars franchise existed of the Death Star. And it's a ground-based terrestrial power supply centered around this enormous crystal in a tower with a retracting dome. And Cayce says at some point this could be turned into a weapon or even just misused. And he says actually for the second destruction, that was directly responsible, that the crystal was overtuned and it basically fractured the landmass of Atlantis and destroyed everything around it at the time in the mid-Atlantic. So again, I make no claim to know what happened. All I'm saying is, look, here are things that are true, provable by scientists that this man said happened. Here's what the ancient Greeks said. The same people that built civilization and philosophy. This is what they said. Plato said this is not a, fake story. Every word of it is true. He begins the dialogue with, I know this is a strange story, Socrates, but every word of it is true. Which I find strange that he would do that. I also think it's strange that the story comes from Egypt.
Definitely.
People forget it doesn't come from ancient Greece. It comes from Egypt. They told the Greeks. So the Greeks are just telling an Egyptian story. And then I find it strange that there's an Egyptian story about Atlantis as well. And then I also find it strange that there are similarities, culturally between the indigenous populations of the world that allegedly, according to mainstream science, had no contact until Columbus, went on his warpath and Cortez and everybody followed. Like, why do the Aztecs have a god called Atlanteotl who's holding the world on his shoulders? That's identical to the Greek European god of Atlas, if the two never communicated in the ancient past. I find that an impossible coincidence. And what's separating Atlanteotl and Atlas? The Atlantic Ocean, which again, like it's right there. It's hidden in plain sight on a map,
It's always hidden in plain sight. It's always in front of us, and we just don't want to see it, or we just overlook it. I don't want to say we don't want to see it. A lot of times we just overlook the mundane, the obvious, and we're looking for something much more difficult when it's just right there in front of us.
That's right. And I always tell people, because I tried my hardest to convince myself, actually, as the writer, that this was all a fantasy. So that's the approach I wrote the book in. I didn't write this to prove. I actually wrote the book attempting to show how unlikely it was. And in doing so, realized it actually is very likely that this thing called Atlantis did exist. But I always tell people, because pictures are always much more viscerally, I think, convincing than words. And go to my website, michaellaflam.com. Go to the top left of the graphic, and you see a map from 1960 of the oceans drained. And I always tell people, you want to know where it is? Look in the middle of the damn Atlantic Ocean. And what do you see there, Rye? An enormous landmass where the Azores peak out today.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and
There it is.
I'm gonna post this on I'll superimpose this when I edit this. But
Right. And that's to
exactly, it's right
me,
there. It's right there.
it's to me, if you deny that, like that's not off the coast of Florida, that's not off the coast of California, that's right where Plato said it was. There you
It's there.
go. It's
It's all
right
there
there.
for you.
And I'm sure the governments of the world are aware of this. I'm sure the Portuguese government has discovered that pyramid that an old man who I've talked to personally, Mr. Silva, who found an enormous Giza pyramid type structure at the bottom of the ocean while fishing. And the Portuguese government sent the Navy and then said, wow, this is just a natural rock formation and nothing to see here. It's like, of course they know that. Of course they know that. The government knows there's a sunken city off the western coast of Cuba that was discovered 25 years ago that they've never gone back to. You know what I mean? I just think it's easier for them to keep people basically in ignorance.
Yeah,
We don't need to
placated.
change the curriculum at Harvard.
Yes,
Everything's been
exactly.
solved. There's no more mysteries in the world. The slaves built the pyramids. The Mayans did human sacrifice. Columbus discovered the New World, even though the Chinese very likely discovered the New World in 1421. But let's just go back to sleep.
Exactly.
And much easier for everybody. So
fantastic. Well, Michael Laflam, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And one last time, well, I know I just I'll be posting your website on just in that last little bit, but where can everybody find you and find your book?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for listening to my ranting and raving.
It was amazing. I loved it.
But if you'd like to contact me, you can go to michaellaflam.com. One word. My last name is 2, but it's one word on the website. And the book is called Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. Not to be confused, if you type in Visions of Atlantis on Amazon, you get the pirate metal band, Visions of Atlantis. They always, which is awesome. I got to give them a copy of the book. Yeah, they're the unofficial soundtrack, I guess, to my work. But they came first, and I was not aware of them when I came up with the name. So great minds. I'm linked to a pirate metal band from Europe. But the book is on Amazon, and it's available in English, Spanish, and I'm working on the French and Portuguese translations this month as well. So you can find it as Visiones de la Atlántida in Spanish and Visions of Atlantis in English, and also Kindle, hardcover, softcover, and an audiobook.
Awesome. Again, Michael Laflam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
All right, everyone. I want to say that was really interesting. A lot of talk about Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet. It's so that brings us an end to this fascinating journey into the mysterious of Atlantis. There was. I just want to say again, a huge thank you to Michael Laflam for sharing his incredible insights and for opening my mind to the possibility of, what was before us here, through his book, Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. And his deep dive into Edgar Cayce there, really going in further into that was really interesting as well. And, I just want to say, if this conversation resonated with you, make sure you check out his book for an even deeper dive. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, share the episode with your fellow truth seekers, and explore my store and keep the mysteries alive. So until next time, stay curious, keep the exploring unknown. And as I always say, keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always find your way home.
I look forward to our next adventure together as we navigate the mysteries that lie ahead. Until our paths cross again, keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always find your way home.